Muskingum County, Ohio, April 1883. The last lot of the season.
The scrap dealer opened the bidding. Nobody moved.
He looked at it the way her father taught her, not what it was, but what it could become.
The room understood. Something was about to happen that had already been decided. $48.
The man who sold her the tin looked like he wanted to apologize for it. Edgar Brevard Jr. stood at the far edge of the Brevard Iron Works yard on a Tuesday morning in April of 1883, hands clasped behind his back, weight shifting from boot to boot, while a thin wind came off the Muskingum River and moved through the stacked bundles along the rear fence, as if even the weather wanted nothing to do with what was being offered. He had his father's yard, his father's name on the deed, and his father's workers watching from the mill floor doorway, with the patient attention of men who have been told to look busy but have run out of things to pretend to do. The lot he was selling had been accumulating since 1874. That was the charitable version. What Temperance Aldrich was actually looking at, standing in the mud of the Brevard yard with her arms folded against the April cold, was 9 years of compounded mistakes. Sheets bent on the slitter when the blade tracking went out, and nobody caught it until 40 linear feet were already ruined. Coils that had crowned in storage because they had been stacked wrong through 2 wet winters, and the galvanizing had lifted in long bubbling seams. Panels crimped at the hem by a press that a foreman had adjusted incorrectly in 1876, and nobody had documented the adjustment, so nobody knew how to reverse it, so they had simply routed those panels to the back fence and hoped the situation would resolve itself. There were lengths that had been walked on, rolled over by the yard cart at least twice, bent at angles that suggested the cart operator had been navigating by optimism. There were sheets where the rust had started at the cut edge and moved inward like something with patience and intention. Brevard had told the small crowd gathered at the mill's quarterly clearance that the lot was being offered at scrap weight, that he made no representations about condition, and that anyone was welcome to bid. But he personally would not recommend it. He said this with the tone of a man reading a prepared statement he had hoped would never be necessary. The scrap buyer from Zanesville opened at $14. He was a broad man in a canvas coat, with the particular confidence of someone who believes his presence is doing everyone a favor. Nobody in the crowd moved. He raised his own bid to $20, which was still essentially an offer to haul the problem away. He looked around the yard with the expression of a man waiting for applause. Temperance bid $27. The scrap buyer looked at her. She looked at the tin. There was a pause that lasted several seconds, and in those seconds the crowd at the Brevard yard did the silent arithmetic of strangers, watching something they cannot quite explain. He bid $33. She bid $48. He shrugged with the whole top half of his body, turned and walked toward his wagon. Brevard brought the hammer down with the expression of a man who had expected this transaction to require considerably more of his morning. Othniel Sparks had been standing at Temperance's left shoulder through the entire proceeding. He was her brother-in-law by way of her younger sister Louisa, a carpenter from Perry County who had married into the Aldrich orbit and had never entirely found his footing there. He was a decent man, which is to say he meant well in most situations, and a cautious man, which is to say he sometimes meant well out loud when silence would have served better. He was there because Louisa had asked him to accompany Tempe to the mill clearance, and Louisa had asked because she had heard what her sister was planning and had a feeling about it. Othniel looked at the tin. He looked at Tempe. He turned his hat in his hands once, a habit of his when he was working out how to say something. "What in the world are you going to do with bent tin?" She didn't turn to look at him. "Straighten it." "That wasn't what I meant." She knew. She had known before he finished the sentence. The question underneath the question was the one the whole crowd was asking in the particular quiet of people who have watched something they cannot account for and are deciding how to feel about it. Not what she would do with the tin. What kind of woman buys bent tin? What that purchase says about judgment, about future decisions, about whether the investment of continued community goodwill is warranted. She had been answering that question, one way or another, since 1869. She had not found a satisfying way to answer it yet. She was beginning to suspect the satisfying version would have to come later, and would have to speak for itself, and that in the meantime, the only useful response was to load the tin onto the wagon and drive it home, which is what she did. The story moved the way stories move in counties where the distance between farms means news travels slower than silence. It went from the Brevard yard to Vought's General Store on the main street of Hales Crossing sometime that afternoon, carried by the carter who had helped load the tin, and who stopped at Vought's for tobacco, and was still talking about it when the storekeeper's wife came in from the back room. From Vaught's it went to the cooperative warehouse on Dillon Falls Road, where the Tuesday morning farmers talked while they waited for the grain grader, and from the warehouse it went to Mabel's Ordinary on the square, where it became part of the breakfast conversation on Wednesday morning. From Mabel's it made it to the Methodist churchyard by Sunday, where it had accumulated details that nobody present at the Brevard clearance could have witnessed. By Sunday, the tin was so far gone that even the rust was embarrassed to be on it. By Sunday, the scrap buyer had shaken his head and said something that people were now quoting, without quite being able to agree on the exact wording. By Sunday, the purchase of $48 had become a kind of community verdict, the way that verdicts form in places where everyone knows everyone else's business, and the knowing creates a responsibility to have opinions about it. The thing the county had decided about Temperance Aldrich was not complicated. She was stubborn in ways that would eventually cost her. The $48 seemed to prove it. People laughed about it through the spring. They were still laughing quietly at the warehouse through summer. They stopped laughing, not all at once but gradually, the way a room goes quiet when someone says something that rearranges everything said before it, sometime around 1891. But we are not there yet. First, let me tell you who Temperance Aldrich was, and where she came from, and what she had been taught to see when other people saw waste. Because what she did with that bent tin, and with the years of bent tin that followed, only makes sense once you understand the shop behind the farmhouse on Dillon Falls Road and the man who built it, and the particular education he delivered, without ever once announcing that education was what was happening. Silas Aldrich was not a hobbyist. He was not a man who kept a few tools in a lean-to and called himself handy on Sunday afternoons. Silas had learned the trade of sheet metal fabrication in Pittsburgh in the 1840s, working first as a sweeper in a shop that made stovepipe and guttering, then as an apprentice cutter, then as a full journeyman fabricator who could lay out a complex valley flashing from a hand-drawn plan and cut it without a wasted inch. He had worked for a roofing and siding contractor in Zanesville through most of the following decade, built a reputation for close tolerances and clean hemwork, and come back to Muskingum County in 1848 with enough saved to buy 65 acres on the east side of the county and enough skill to build every structure on those acres himself. The farmhouse went up in the fall of 1848, the barn the following spring, the root cellar, the smokehouse, the chicken house in the years after. Then in 1850, the shop. The shop was the thing Silas built the way another man might build a church. The floor was poured concrete, floated to a level tolerance he was proud of, and never stopped being proud of for the 31 years he worked on it. He had poured it himself with the help of 2 neighbors and a system of screeds he had designed specifically for the task, and when it cured, he walked it with a spirit level and did not find a spot that troubled him. The walls were board and batten oak from the county mill, built square off the concrete slab. The roof was standing seam tin, profile run on his own equipment, installed by his own hands on 3 consecutive October days in 1851. It did not leak in 1851. It did not leak in 1883, when Temperance was working under it. It had not leaked once in between. The equipment inside the shop had been assembled over 20 years with the patience of a man who understood that the right tool bought used at the right time is worth more than the wrong tool bought new at the wrong time. The 8-foot brake had come from a Zanesville contractor in 1852, bought for $60 and rebuilt over one winter until it ran true. The hand-operated slip roller came from an estate sale in Guernsey County in 1856 for $12. The sheet shear had been manufactured in Cincinnati, purchased secondhand in 1859, at a price Silas considered reasonable and never disclosed to anyone. Cleaned, sharpened, and mounted to a hardwood stand he built to his own dimensions so that the cutting height matched exactly the distance from his elbow to the floor when he stood at full extension. The cutting oil for the shear was in a tin can on the shelf above the blade. It had been there since 1854. It was still there when Temperance used the shear for the first time alone in the spring of 1883, and the oil was still good. On the pegboard beside the shear, 4 pairs of tin snips hung in the order Silas had acquired them. The 8-inch straights first, the offset ducks second, the aviation-style curve cuts third, and the long blade heavies last, bought in 1868 for work on a neighbor's barn that Silas had done as a favor and kept the snips as partial payment. Above the brake, on a shelf made of a single oak plank, stood a row of index cards written in pencil in Silas's close, even hand. Each card documented the gauge tolerances and bend radii he had worked out by trial for every common roofing profile he had encountered in 30 years of fabrication work. Spring-back angles by gauge, clamp pressure settings for different material tempers, hem gap specifications for 3 types of standing seam lock. The cards were not beautiful documents. The pencil had been pressed hard, and in a few places the cardstock had furrowed slightly under the pressure. But they were accurate. Silas Aldrich had verified each figure against actual results, and corrected the ones that did not match. He trusted the cards because he had tested them, and he updated them when reality disagreed with what was written. Temperance had read those cards so many times that she could recite them without looking. She still looked. The handwriting was his, and she found that steadying, and she had learned over the years not to dismiss things that were steadying simply because they were also unnecessary. Silas taught his daughter the trade, the way farmers teach children the things they believe matter. Through proximity and repetition, without formal announcement, without ceremony, in the same way you teach someone to read weather, or to know when the soil is ready, or to understand by the sound of an axle whether it needs grease or replacement. Temperance was handing him tools by the time she was 9. She was feeding sheet stock into the break under supervision by 13. At 16, she could lay out a standing seam panel from scratch, mark both ends for the hem, run the cuts on the shear, and fold both long edges on the break without being told the sequence, because the sequence had become something she understood from the inside rather than followed from the outside. Silas watched her work and did not perform approval as approval. When she made a mistake, he showed her what the mistake had produced and where the reasoning had gone wrong and moved on. When her work was good, he sometimes said so and sometimes simply continued. The time he told her she had good hands, she was 17 and had just cut and hemmed a 12-foot valley, flashing that fitted the first time without adjustment. He said it once quietly and went back to laying out the next section. She carried that sentence for the rest of her life the same way you carry a compass, not displayed, not discussed, but always consulted. What Silas also gave her, in the same unannounced way, was the habit of looking at damaged material and asking a specific question before any other question. Not whether it was damaged, not how badly, but whether the damage was past use or only past first use. Those were not the same question, and the difference between them was the difference between scrap and feedstock. And the difference between feedstock and a finished product that someone would pay for was almost always a question of whether the right person was willing to do the arithmetic first. In the late summer of 1869, Temperance Aldrich had a place reserved at the Western Female Seminary in Oxford, Ohio. The seminary was not a university in the full sense, but it was rigorous and it was respected. And there was a woman in the Natural Sciences Department whose correspondence with the county Methodist minister had convinced him that Temperance was exactly the kind of student the institution needed. The minister had written a letter of recommendation himself and had included a note about the quality of her reasoning that he later said he stood by completely. The place had been arranged. A small grant from the Muskingum County Women's Educational Society covered the first term. The rest would be managed through careful economy and a promissory arrangement with the county bank to be settled over 5 years beginning in 1874. She had a suitcase packed. She had the train ticket in the drawer of the nightstand, tucked under the corner of the Bible there. She had a list of books to buy, written on the inside cover of a composition notebook she planned to take with her. In the 3rd week of August, Silas Aldrich collapsed in the shop beside the break. Her brother Warren found him 40 minutes later when he came to borrow a straight snip and found the door open and no answer to his calling. The doctor from Zanesville said it was the blood, meaning the vessels, meaning the kind of event that happened in the blood vessels of the brain and left its marks behind in the quality of movement and the reliability of sensation. Silas's right hand worked, but not with the pressure or precision it had worked before. His left eye tracked, but not independently. He could not operate the slip roller alone. He could not hold sheet stock steady against the fence of the shear while operating the handle with his other hand. The suitcase stayed where it was. The train ticket stayed in the drawer. Temperance stayed on Dillon Falls Road. She did not describe this to anyone as a sacrifice. The few times it came up over the years, she said she had made a choice, and that choices were not the same as sacrifices, and she preferred not to confuse the two. The people she said this to generally changed the subject, because there was nowhere comfortable to go from there. And the particular firmness with which she said it suggested that nowhere comfortable was precisely where she intended to leave it. Silas recovered some function in his right hand over the following 18 months, enough to supervise, to advise, to work at the bench on small forming tasks that did not require 2 hands at full strength. Not enough to run the shop alone. Temperance ran it alongside him through the early part of the 1870s, and then as the recovery plateaued and it became clear that certain capacities were not returning, she ran more of it, and then most of it, and then, without a specific day on which this became official, all of it. Her brother Warren moved to Columbus in 1871 to work for a hardware importer. Her sister Louisa married Othniel Sparks of Perry County in 1873 and settled in New Lexington. In 1875, Temperance herself married Edgar Aldrich, a carpenter from Guernsey County who had come to Muskingum County to work a framing contract for a church in Zanesville and had stayed because the work extended and then because Temperance was there. And the combination of those two facts arranged themselves into something permanent. Edgar was a quiet man which suited her. He was precise in his work and unhurried in his thinking, and he understood without being told that the shop and the farm operated as a single system, and that the system required attention that was not negotiable. He kept his own counsel, did what was needed, and did not make claims on her time that the work didn't support. They were partners in the oldest and most practical sense of the word, and if their marriage lacked the kind of demonstrative warmth that their neighbors occasionally remarked on, it had something that lasted better. Mutual respect expressed through consistent action rather than intermittent declaration. He died in November of 1879. 4 days of fever, then a morning he did not wake from. Tempe was 27 years old. She buried him in the Methodist cemetery on the county road, planted a small red cedar at the head of the grave because he had once said he liked the smell of them, and drove back to the farm and did the evening chores. She did not stop. There was not, in the practical calendar of a farm in Muskingum County in 1879, a space in which stopping was available. The stock needed feeding. The shop had orders. The winter was coming. Silas died in March of 1881. He had been failing since the previous October in the slow, deliberate way that some constitutions choose, giving everyone time to prepare, and then not making the preparation feel like it had been worth anything. He died on a Tuesday morning in the shop, which was where he had spent most of his waking hours for 30 years, which was where he had asked to be brought the previous afternoon, when the doctor said there was not much left to manage. He sat in the chair beside the brake with a blanket across his knees, and Temperance sat beside him, and they did not talk much, and what they said was not remarkable, and he was gone before noon. He left her the farm, the shop, the tools, and the 65 acres on the east side of Muskingum County, all of it paid for. No mortgage, no equipment debt, no liens of any kind. He also left a savings account at the Muskingum Valley Savings Bank in Zanesville with $3,100 in it, accumulated over 30 years by the method of spending less than he earned every year without exception. Temperance deposited the inheritance, kept the account at the same bank, and continued the same method. Not because it was the only way she knew, but because the ledger told her the truth about her operation, and she preferred truth to comfort even when comfort was available. Now, the bent tin. 3 months before the clearance sale at Brevard Iron Works, in the January of 1883, Temperance had driven her wagon 28 miles east and north to an equipment swap meet in McConnellsville, the seat of Morgan County, held each year in the grain warehouse near the river, when the winter was dry enough to make the roads passable. She had not gone to buy anything specific. She had gone because her father had given her the habit of going to places where tools changed hands and listening to what was said by the people who worked with those tools. Because what they said when they were not trying to be informative was frequently the most useful thing said all morning. She found Rufus Cade at a folding table near the warehouse's east wall, behind a display of roofing tools that included a 10-year-old seamer, 3 mallets in declining condition, a chalk line reel, and a pair of long blade snips that were the same pattern as Silas's heavies. He was 64 years old and built like a man who had spent 4 decades carrying loads up ladders. Wide through the shoulders, thickened at the forearms, with the careful way of moving that belongs to people whose joints have been renegotiating their terms of service for some years. He was selling the tools because his hands had reached the point where the Ohio winters made them unreliable, and unreliable hands on a roof were not a condition you managed around. He had the easy manner of retired tradesmen who no longer have anything to prove and have arrived at a kind of authority that comes only from not needing it. They talked for almost an hour, standing beside his table while the warehouse moved around them, and deals were made and equipment changed hands in the casual commerce of men who understood what things were actually worth. The market he described was not a discovery he was offering. It was something he mentioned the way you mention the grade of a road you have driven many times, as background information too obvious to elaborate. The German Baptist Brethren communities scattered through Licking County and Knox County and Wayne County in Ohio, and eastward into Somerset County in Pennsylvania, built continuously. They built with their own labor, which meant they needed materials, not contractors. They bought on 2 criteria, price and durability, not appearance. Salvaged-roofing tin, if it was flat and the galvanizing was sound, was entirely acceptable to them. They were not purchasing for aesthetics. They were purchasing for weather resistance and service life, and on both of those measures, properly reclaimed sheet tin was indistinguishable from new material to a man nailing it down on a cold November morning. Rufus had supplied a few of the Ohio communities himself in the 1860s, working with a scrap collector in Newark who had access to mill rejects from a small operation in Coshocton County. The margin had been acceptable. The buyers had paid promptly, in cash without negotiation, because the price was fair, and both parties understood what fair meant and no one had an interest in complicating it. He had stopped when his back became an issue in the mid-1870s, and as far as he knew, no one had picked up the supply since then. The market was essentially unserved, he said, not because it was unprofitable, but because the combination required was unusual. You needed the equipment to process the material, which was a brake and a shear at minimum, and a slip roller if you were doing any formed work. You needed the knowledge to run the equipment on irregular salvage material, which was not the same as running it on new stock, and took some learning before it took no thought at all. You needed the disposition to source the raw material, which meant building relationships with mills and contractors who considered their rejects a nuisance and were primarily motivated to have someone else deal with them. Most people who had the equipment didn't want the margin. Most people who wanted the margin didn't have the equipment. Temperance drove home through the frozen fields of Muskingum County that afternoon with the specific quality of calm that settles on a person when the problem they have been looking at obliquely comes suddenly into direct focus. She spent the month of February at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a pencil in her hand, working the numbers forward and backward until she understood exactly what the arithmetic was telling her and was confident it was not telling her something she wanted to hear rather than something true. She had the equipment. Silas had built and bought and assembled it over 20 years and left it to her clear. She had the knowledge. 15 years of working the brake and shear and slip roller on everything from simple valley flashings to complex hip roof transitions had given her the material sense that Rufus Cade described, the kind of understanding that lives in the hands rather than the head. She had the shop and the farm and no debt against either. The only thing she did not have was the feedstock. The feedstock was sitting against the rear fence of the Brevard Iron Works yard in Zanesville, being rained on and waited on and offered at scrap weight because nobody had decided what else to do with it. $48. That was the number the arithmetic produced. That was what she was willing to pay for 9 years of accumulated mill mistakes, and that number was not based on sentiment or stubbornness or the particular satisfaction of outbidding a scrap buyer from Zanesville. It was based on a calculation she had done at the kitchen table in February and verified twice, a calculation that accounted for the banding wire and the zinc paint for edge treatment and the new clamp pads for the brake that Silas had been meaning to replace since 1877. And the wood for the stove through April, and the realistic estimate of what percentage of the lot would be genuinely past recovery as opposed to past first use. The calculation came out to a specific number. The auction came to that number and she bid it, and when the scrap buyer stopped at 33 and she bid 48, she was not gambling. She was executing a decision already made. That was the thing no one at the Brevard yard that Tuesday morning understood. They saw a woman buying bent tin. They were watching a woman deploy a plan she had spent 3 months verifying. The gap between those two descriptions was the entire story, and the entire story would take several years to become visible, and in the meantime the county would fill the gap with the interpretation most available to it, which was that stubbornness had gotten the better of her judgment again. The afternoon she loaded the wagon at the Brevard yard, with Othniel helping despite his reservations, because he was a decent man and the tin was heavy. She said nothing more about what she intended. She drove back to Hales Crossing on the river road, put the team away, and went to look at the shop. The shop had not changed since Silas died. She had maintained it the way he had maintained it, which meant nothing was where it did not belong, and everything that needed oil had oil. And the concrete floor was swept at the end of every working session. The brake stood against the north wall where it had always stood, the orange paint worn to bare iron at the clamping bar ends but the mechanism sound. The shear hung on its hardwood stand. The slip roller sat in the corner with its handles vertical. The tin can of cutting oil was on the shelf above the blade. The index cards were on the oak plank shelf above the brake. She took one down and read it in the fading shop light and put it back exactly where it had been. She was not ready to start yet. The ground was still too wet to take the wagon into the near field, and there were spring chores ahead of the processing work, and she had learned from Silas the virtue of doing one thing completely before beginning the next. But she stood in the shop for a few minutes with her arms at her sides and looked at the equipment and made the kind of accounting that does not involve numbers. Whether the tools were what she needed, whether the space was adequate, whether the sequence she had planned in her head at the kitchen table was still the sequence that made sense when she was looking at the actual machines. It was. She knew it was. She turned off the lamp and went back to the house. Outside on the wagon in the yard, the tin sat bundled in its wires, bent and gapped and rust-edged, exactly what the county had decided it was. A mistake, $48 worth of stubborn error, the kind of purchase that confirmed what people already suspected about a woman who had been making hard choices since 1869 and had never once explained herself to anyone's satisfaction. They were still laughing about it in the summer. They would be laughing about it at the cooperative warehouse in the fall, in the careful, quiet way of a community that is committed to a verdict and prefers not to reconsider. But here is what was true underneath the laughter, under the $48 price, and the bent tin and Othniel's hat turning in his hands on the drive home. The gap between what the market decided something was worth and what it would be worth, after the right person applied. The right knowledge to it was exactly the size of the space Silas Aldrich had spent 30 years preparing his daughter to occupy. She had good hands. He had said so once on a cold October afternoon and gone back to work. The tin was on the wagon. The shop was ready. The calculation had been done and checked and done again. All that remained was April. April came in cold and stayed cold through the first 2 weeks, the kind of Ohio spring that makes no promises and keeps the ones it makes reluctantly. The shop held the night chill until mid-morning, even with the stove running, and Temperance started work before the light was fully up, banking the firebox high with the split hickory she had put up the previous fall and letting the heat build while she opened the first bale. The baling wire from Brevard's yard was a mixed collection of gauges, some of it proper tie wire, and some of it whatever had been nearest when someone needed to secure a bundle before the end of the day. She cut it carefully and coiled it for reuse. Silas had taught her that wire is wire until it isn't, and this wire had further service in it. She spread each bale across the shop floor one at a time and went through it piece by piece. The sorting took the better part of 2 evenings. She carried a short length of straight stock as a reference straight edge, and for each panel she laid the reference across the face of the sheet and read what the gap told her. The first category was sheets that had taken a simple planar bow, the kind that comes from uneven storage pressure, where the metal wanted to lie curved in one direction along its length. The break could address a bow that occupied a single plane without complication. The second category was sheets with compound deformation, bent in more than one axis, the kind that came from being rolled over or from a press misalignment that drove force into the metal at an angle. Those required sequencing, secondary correction before primary, and patience. The third category was sheets where the galvanizing had separated from the base metal over an area large enough to compromise the panel's weather resistance, even after flattening. The third category came out to roughly 8% of the total material. She stacked those sheets separately near the shop door, where they would go to the actual scrap buyer when she had enough to make a delivery worthwhile. The remaining 92% she organized by category and by gauge, working with a small scribe to mark each sheet's gauge on the edge where she had checked it with the gauge tool from Silas's workbench. Then she opened the ledger. It was an ordinary account book, green cloth cover, the kind sold at any dry goods store in Zanesville for 30 cents. Silas had kept one like it for the shop since 1851, a new volume every 5 or 6 years as pages filled, and the current volume had been started by him in 1878 and had his entries through February of 1881. Then a gap of 4 weeks while he was dying, then her entries beginning in March of that year, in a different hand but the same format: date, material, source, cost, processing notes, sale price, net. She had kept the format exactly. It was not sentiment. It was that the format worked, and changing a format that works to make it your own is a kind of vanity she had no use for. She wrote the date, April 9, 1883. She listed the purchase, one clearance lot, Brevard Iron Works, Zanesville. She listed the price, $48. Then she listed the additional costs as she incurred them over the following days. $3.50 for replacement banding wire from Vots, $6.50 for zinc paint and linseed oil for cut edge treatment and spot repair where the original coating had bubbled, $11 for new clamp pads for the brake, ordered from the manufacturer's agent in Columbus, which arrived 8 days later in a paper parcel and took her one morning to fit, $2.10 for firewood through the cold stretch of the month. Total outlay, $71.10. She underlined it. The underlining was from Silas. A line under a total means the total is established, and you are building forward from it, not backward. The brake work began in the second week of April, evenings after the day's farm chores, full days on Saturdays when the wet ground kept her out of the fields. She started with the plainer bows, because those were fastest and would give her a sense of the lot's overall character before she committed hours to the more demanding compound work. She fed the first bowed sheet into the brake, clamped it, felt through the handle the resistance of the metal, and made the first corrective pass. The springback was exactly what she expected for 26 gauge at this temper, 3 degrees on a 90-degree correction bend. She had set the back gauge to account for it before the first pass. The sheet came out flat within a tolerance that would pass any roofing inspection she had ever seen conducted. She checked it with the reference straight edge and set it on the finished stack. There was a particular quality to work that is correctly understood before it begins. It is not exciting. It does not produce the kind of feeling associated with discovery or risk. It produces something quieter and more durable, the satisfaction of a prediction confirmed, of a calculation that held. Silas had called it the only honest pleasure in the trade, meaning the pleasure that cannot be manufactured or pretended, because the material either conforms to the prediction or it does not, and the material is not susceptible to flattery or wishful thinking. She worked through the planar bows first, then moved to the compound deformation sheets. The compound work was slower. Each sheet had to be read before it was touched. The primary and secondary deformation axes identified, the sequence established. Secondary correction first, clamp, release slowly, check. Then primary correction, clamp, release, check. A sheet that looked like a straightforward single-axis problem sometimes revealed a secondary bow only after the first correction, the metal having redistributed its stress during the initial bending event, and stored a second deformation that wasn't visible until the first was addressed. Those required a third pass. She had made the mistake of going out of sequence once, in 1871, on a piece of new stock she had been rushing. The metal had work-hardened at the intersection of the two deformation axes and cracked along a line 6 inches from the end. Silas had not said anything when she showed him the cracked sheet. He had looked at the crack, looked at the sheet as a whole, asked her what sequence she had used. She told him. He nodded once and went back to what he had been doing. She had not gone out of sequence since. The reheming was the finishing work. A standing seam panel requires a consistent hem along both long edges, a folded lip of specific width and gap that locks into the adjacent panel's hem to form the weather-tight seam. Panels that had been bent typically had hem damage at the point of deformation, the lip crushed or opened or torqued out of plane. Temperance ran every recovered panel through the break a second time to reform the hem, using the die Silas had ground from a piece of tooling stock in 1863 specifically for standing seam work. She checked each hem with the gauge tool, a piece of flat stock Silas had milled to the correct gap dimension and hung on a nail beside the slip roller. Panels that passed the gauge went to the finished stack. Panels where the hem still showed irregularity, after 2 passes went back through a third time, or if the third pass did not resolve it, were evaluated for whether the irregularity was within the tolerance a field roofer could manage. By the middle of May, the first lot was processed. 395 linear feet of recovered standing seam panel in 26 and 28 gauge profiles. She bundled them in groups of 20 with the reused baling wire, tagged each bundle with a card noting gauge, profile, and length, and stacked them along the north wall of the shop where they would be out of the weather but accessible for loading. Then she wrote a letter. She had gotten the name of the community elder from Rufus Cade in January. On a scrap of paper he had written out at the swap meet and handed to her without ceremony, as if passing along the address of a feed supplier. The community was German Baptist Brethren, settled on good ground outside Chesterville in Morrow County, 60 miles northwest of Hales Crossing. The elder was a man named Ezekiel Brumbaugh, and Rufus had described him as a man who said what he meant and paid what he owed, and had no interest in negotiating prices that were already fair. The letter took her 2 evenings to compose, not because she lacked words, but because she wanted the letter to say exactly what was true without ornamentation. She described what she had: the profile, the gauge, the linear footage, the hem specification, the condition of the material. She described the price per linear foot, which she had calculated from the ledger, and then checked by working backward from the price that would represent a reasonable margin on her documented costs. She described her location and the options for delivery or collection. She did not describe her history or her qualifications, or make any argument for the quality of her work beyond the technical description of the finished material. The material would speak for itself or it would not, and a letter full of advocacy for the letter writer was not the kind of letter a man like Ezekiel Brumbaugh was likely to read past the second paragraph. The reply came in 12 days, in a hand that was plain and compressed, and got to the point in 3 sentences. The footage was adequate for what they needed. The price was acceptable. Could she deliver by the last Friday of June? She could. The delivery was 60 miles on roads that were better than winter, but not what they would be by August. She loaded the wagon the evening before, distributing the bundles for balance and lashing them with rope in the pattern. Silas had shown her for heat metal loads, which concentrated the tie-down pressure at the bundle ends, where the banding wire reinforced the edges, rather than across the face of the sheets, where pressure could redeform material that had just been corrected. She left before full light on Friday morning. The Brumbaugh farm was on good flat ground, the buildings arranged with the particular efficiency of communities where construction is a collective act and every structure has been planned before the first timber is cut. Ezekiel Brumbaugh came out to the lane when she pulled in, a man in his 60s with a face that had been weathered into something definite, the kind of face that makes immediate evaluations and does not revise them without reason. He looked at the wagon, walked to the nearest bundle, took out a pocket knife, cut the banding on one end, and pulled a panel halfway out of the stack. He looked at the hem on the long edge. He looked at the face of the panel. He ate it down its length. He slid it back into the bundle and looked at Temperance. Flat, not a question. Flat, not an elaboration. He nodded. He paid in cash, counting the bills from a fold in his coat pocket, correct to the penny at $182, and handed the money across with the directness of a man who considers financial transactions to be practical matters that should be completed efficiently so that the rest of the day can proceed. She drove back to Hales Crossing with the empty wagon and the $182 and a specific quality of clarity that she recognized from the kitchen table in February. The same clarity she had felt when the arithmetic finished and told her what it was going to tell her. $110.90 of net revenue on a $71.10 investment. 8 weeks of evenings and Saturdays, 1 delivery. She wrote the number in the ledger, drew the line under it, and drove back to Zanesville the following week to ask Edgar Brevard Jr. about the next available clearance lot. This was where the conversation became something other than a single transaction. Brevard had not expected her back. That was visible in the half-second adjustment he made when she appeared in the yard office door, the brief recalibration of a man who had filed something and was now being asked to retrieve it. He offered her a chair. She sat. What she proposed was not complicated, which was part of why it took him a moment to evaluate it. His mill generated reject and clearance material at a predictable rate. The current system required accumulating that material, bundling it irregularly, and then disposing of it at quarterly clearance sales that were awkward for everyone involved, because selling scrap at your own facility in front of customers who were there to buy new stock was a form of public disclosure that no manufacturer found comfortable. What she was offering was a standing arrangement. She would take the clearance material on a regular basis, at a price she would commit to in advance, paid immediately upon transfer, no negotiation, no inspection complaints, no expectations about condition beyond what she could assess herself at the time of transfer. For Brevard, the arithmetic was straightforward. The material left the yard on a predictable schedule, at a known price, without the management burden of quarterly sales logistics. For Temperance, the arithmetic was equally straightforward. She had a reliable feedstock supply. He said he would think about it. She said she would come back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, he said yes. They shook hands across the yard office desk, and the arrangement was not written down, because in Muskingum County in 1883, a handshake between two parties who both understood what they were agreeing to was considered sufficient documentation. The arrangement held for 11 years without a dispute. She told no one in Hales Crossing about it. Not because she was hiding anything, but because it had not come up, and she saw no reason to introduce it into conversation. The county had already arrived at its conclusions about the tin purchase in April. Interrupting those conclusions with additional information would require an explanation she was not interested in providing. The information would become available in time. The time was not yet. What followed was not a single event but a process, the kind of story that is difficult to tell because its drama is arithmetic rather than incident, accumulation rather than explosion. Over the following years, the supply lines multiplied with the patience of someone who understood that each new source required a relationship to be built and a process to be established, and neither could be rushed without creating problems that would cost more than the rushing saved. In 1884, a roofing contractor in Dresden named Aldous Payne, who had been dumping his job site cutoffs and panel offcuts into the creek bottom behind his equipment barn for 7 years, was informed by the county that the creek bottom was not an acceptable disposal site and that he had 60 days to address the situation. Aldous Payne's solution to most problems was to find someone else to deal with them. He had heard through the particular circuit of county trades talk that there was a woman in Hales Crossing who was buying tin scrap. He drove out to find her. Temperance agreed to take his cutoffs on a standing basis. He would deliver them when he had a load. She would pay a price per hundredweight that covered his hauling cost, plus a modest amount that made the arrangement worth his while, and the creek bottom behind his barn would be spared further deposits. The arrangement suited both parties because it turned a compliance problem into a minor revenue stream for him and a second feedstock source for her. And neither party had to negotiate against the other because their interests did not conflict. 2 years after that, a building materials dealer in Coshocton named Wendell Birch discovered that the inventory he had stored in his rear warehouse through a wet winter had suffered water damage to a degree that made it unsaleable as new stock. Some of it was tin roofing material, 140 squares of various profiles, some of it edge-rusted, some of it surface-oxidized, most of it structurally sound beneath the cosmetic damage. Wen Birch was a man who understood sunk costs with the pragmatism of someone who has taken enough losses to stop pretending they can be recovered. He sold the lot to Temperance for $90 because the alternative was paying someone to remove it, and she was offering more than zero. The equipment in the shop grew with the work, but slowly, each addition justified by demonstrated need rather than anticipated capacity. The 6-foot sheet shear she added in 1884 came from an estate sale in Guernsey County at $80. It was a lighter machine than Silas's shear, appropriate for the shorter panel offcuts that Aldous Payne's deliveries ran heavily toward, and it freed the main shear for the longer Brevard mill stock without requiring her to change the fence setting between cuts. The smaller 5-foot brake she acquired in 1886 came from Aldous Payne himself, who was replacing his own equipment with a 10-foot unit and had no interest in the old one. $105, delivered, which saved her the loading problem. By 1887, the shop that Silas Aldrich had built on $65 worth of used equipment over 20 years and left to his daughter without a dollar owed on it was processing between 7 and 10 tons of salvaged tin per year. The community buyers had expanded from Morrow County into Licking and Knox and Holmes, and then east across the state line into Somerset County in Pennsylvania. Word having traveled through the networks of communities that sourced materials communally, the network functionally invisible to the county commerce that surrounded it but efficient in its own way. The farm income continued on its own track. The savings account at the Muskingum Valley Savings Bank continued in the same direction it had always moved, by the same method. Temperance did not discuss any of this at Mabel's Ordinary, or at Vaught's or at the Cooperative Warehouse on Dillon Falls Road. She did not discuss it because she was not asked, and she was not asked because the county had moved on to other subjects, as counties do. And the $48 tin purchase had faded from active conversation into the category of things everyone remembered having a position on without quite being able to recall when they had last thought about it. The autumn of 1885 brought the largest single Brevard clearance lot she had taken on, nearly 4 tons of rejected stock from a contract that had been canceled when the buyer's project fell through. Brevard had been sitting on the material since August and was glad to move it. Temperance paid $135 for the lot, the largest single outlay she had made since the arrangement began, and put it in the ledger with the underlining and began the processing in October. November came in hard. The temperature dropped below freezing before the end of the first week and did not recover. The shop stove worked continuously, but the shop was large, and the stove was built for comfort rather than industry, and the concrete floor held the cold the way concrete does, drawing it up through boot leather over the course of a long shift until the feet lost feeling and the hands after them. December brought the news that the gray mare she had bought in 1883 for $42 had developed a lameness that the veterinarian from Zanesville assessed as progressive. She sold the mare to a farmer in Morgan County for what she could get and bought a replacement, a bay gelding from a farm auction in Guernsey County for $55. The numbers netted against each other in the ledger and the loss was manageable. The timing was not ideal. The boy from the farm 2 miles north, young Callum Denby, had been helping with the heavier bale work since the previous spring, moving the bundled stock from the wagon to the floor, shifting processed bundles to the finished stack, loading deliveries. He was 14 and willing and understood, without being told at length, that what was wanted from him was the physical work and not the commentary. In December, he cut his right hand on a shear offcut that had worked loose from a bundle and went home to heal. And his father brought a note explaining that the hand would keep him out of the shop through February at least. By January of 1886, Temperance was working the 4-ton lot alone, in the cold shop, on the schedule that the work required rather than the schedule that would have been comfortable. She had processed roughly 2/3 of the material. The remaining third occupied the north wall in floor-to-ceiling stacks, the bundles sorted by her category system, tagged, waiting. One evening in February, after a session that had run 2 hours past full dark because she had been trying to finish a run of compound correction work while the stove was still hot, she sat down in the chair beside the stove. It was Silas's chair. She had never thought of it as any other kind of chair. It was a ladder back with a woven seat that had been repaired once in 1872 and was due for another repair, the weave softening at the front edge where the most weight fell. Silas had sat in this chair the evening before he died, with the blanket on his knees, and she had sat beside him, and now she sat in it herself and looked at the remaining third of the lot stacked against the north wall in the light of the single lamp she had left burning. This was the only time she asked the question she had refused to ask for 3 years. Not out loud, not to anyone. Only in the specific silence of the February shop with the fire burning down and the cold coming back through the floor. Whether the arithmetic was actually what she had thought it was. Whether the calculations she had made at the kitchen table in January of 1883 still held in the 3rd year in circumstances that had not been in the calculation. The brutal winter, the injured hand, the mare's lameness, the 4-ton lot that was larger than anything she had taken on before and was taking twice as long as the smaller lots had taught her to expect. She sat with the question for perhaps 15 minutes. It was a real question. She did not dismiss it or talk herself past it with reassurances she had not yet earned. She let it be a real question and looked at the north wall and did the arithmetic again in her head from the current position, accounting for the additional costs the winter had produced. The arithmetic still worked. It worked more slowly than in the first year, and the margin was thinner in this particular lot than it had been in the early ones, but it worked. The question answered itself. The way arithmetic does when you do it honestly. without asking for a particular answer first. She stood up. She put another piece of hickory in the stove. She went back to the break. The final deliveries from the 1885 lot went out in April of 1886. The net revenue from the lot, after all costs including the mare replacement, the additional firewood, the banding wire and edge paint, and the new weave for the chair seat she had finally gotten to in March, came out to $274. It was the largest single lot revenue she had recorded. She wrote it in the ledger and underlined it and said nothing to anyone. That summer, the county began to feel the first serious pressure of what would later be understood as an agricultural contraction, though in the summer of 1886, it was still described locally in the language of temporary conditions. A soft grain market, a tight credit season, a year to wait out. The farmers at the cooperative warehouse on Tuesday mornings talked about it the way people talk about weather they have already decided will pass, with the particular confidence that comes from not yet having been proved wrong. Temperance listened to these conversations without participating in them. Not because she had nothing to say, but because what she would have said was not what was being sought. The conversations were about shared conditions seeking shared reassurance, and what she knew about the arithmetic of debt and the arithmetic of a business with no debt were different enough that contributing her perspective would have required an explanation that nobody had asked for. The Metz farm was on the ridge above her south field. Harold Metz and his father before him had farmed that ground since before Temperance was born. 130 acres of good upland soil, visible from her own east field on clear mornings, the woodlot, at its far edge, marking the county road that ran north to Zanesville. She had watched that farm the way you watch a thing that is part of your landscape for long enough that its presence becomes a kind of background fact, noticed only when something changes. What began changing in 1887 was subtle at first. The north field that Harold had kept in continuous rotation was left fallow. The following year, the equipment shed showed missing boards on the south face that were not replaced through the winter. By 1888, Harold was buying less at Vaught's and paying with longer intervals between payments, and the particular economy of a man who is managing a situation he does not yet want to name was visible to anyone who had reason to notice. Harold Metz was not a careless man. He was not a man who had expanded recklessly or borrowed against hope. He was a man who had taken on a note in 1879 to install drainage tile in the low north quarter of his property, a reasonable agricultural improvement at a reasonable interest rate, and who had had the misfortune of making that investment precisely when the markets that would have made the improvement pay back its cost began to soften. By 1889, the note that had been manageable was consuming a portion of his operating income that left nothing for contingency, and farming in Ohio in the late 1880s was an enterprise that required contingency. She watched him sell his equipment at auction in November of 1889, with the same attention she brought to things she could not affect and refused to pretend were not happening. The auction was on a cold day, frost on the ground by morning, the equipment arranged in the yard with the price tags the auctioneer's man had affixed the previous afternoon. Harold stood at the edge of the yard through the morning with his hands in his coat pockets, and when the combine that his father had bought in 1871 sold for less than a quarter of what his father had paid for it, his face did not change in any way visible from where Temperance stood, but something in the set of his shoulders did. She did not goad him. There was nothing to say that would have been useful, and the offer of unhelpful words, however kindly meant, was a form of intrusion she refused to commit. By the following spring, Harold was in a rental house in Zanesville. His wife had family there. The bank held the farm. The land company from Columbus that eventually acquired it from the bank held it for the better part of a year and a half, advertising it at a price nobody in the county could meet, before consigning it to a county land auction with a minimum that finally reflected what the land was actually worth in the current market, rather than the market they had hoped to recover. The auction notice was posted at the Muskingum County Courthouse in Zanesville in February of 1891. Minimum bid, $11 per acre, 130 acres. Temperance read the notice on a Tuesday morning when she was in Zanesville for supplies. She read it twice. She went to the Muskingum Valley Savings Bank that afternoon and had a conversation with Thomas Carver, the bank officer, who had managed her account since 1881, and who had learned over 10 years not to ask questions she hadn't invited. She asked him one question. He answered it. She thanked him and went home. The auction was scheduled for the third Thursday of April. She put the date in the farm ledger, not in the column for expenses or revenues, but in the margin, in the small notation she used for dates she'd not want to mistake. She told no one. Not Othniel, not Louisa, not any of the Tuesday farmers at the cooperative warehouse who had been talking about the Metz property since the bank had taken it. The county would know what she had decided when she had decided it, and in the meantime the information was hers, and she saw no obligation to distribute it in advance. The April of 1891 came in mild, which was unusual. the temperature climbing into the 50s by the second week. The shop work continued. 3 community deliveries went out in March and April to buyers in Holmes County and Knox County, and 1 in Somerset County, all of them repeat customers paying at the same terms and asking no questions about the material beyond the gauge and profile specifications. The ledger column for the first quarter of 1891 showed the operation proceeding exactly as it had been proceeding for 8 years. Feedstock in, processing, product out, revenue recorded, costs subtracted, net written and underlined. On the morning of the 3rd Thursday of April, she put on the brown coat she wore for town and drove the bay gelding into Zanesville. The courthouse on 5th Street was a stone building with the particular gravity of county institutions that have been hearing difficult things for long enough that the walls have absorbed some of the weight. The land auction room was on the 2nd floor. She climbed the stairs, registered her paddle with the clerk at the table by the door, and found a seat near the middle of the room, not at the front where she would be watched, and not at the back where she could not see the bidding clearly. There were 6 paddles registered. She recognized 2 of the other bidders as neighboring farmers from the Hales Crossing area, men who had spoken in the previous months about the Metz property as an opportunity if the price came out right. The other 3 bidders she did not know by name, but their coats and their manner identified them as the kind of men who came to county land auctions from offices in Columbus or Cleveland, representing interests that were accounted for in portfolios rather than in ledgers kept on kitchen tables. The auctioneer opened at $11 per acre. The 2 neighboring farmers bid early, and with the enthusiasm of men who have told themselves and their wives that a particular outcome is possible. One of the Columbus men moved the price methodically. The neighboring farmers held through $14 per acre. At 15, one of them set his paddle down with the careful motion of a man putting away something he cannot afford. At 16, the second set his down with the same motion. The bidding moved between the 3 Columbus men with the efficiency of a transaction among professionals, climbing through $17 and $18 and $19 per acre. At 20, one of them stopped. At 22, the second stopped. The third raised to 24. Temperance raised her paddle. The Columbus man looked at her for the first time. She was looking at the auctioneer. She bid 28. He bid 30. She bid 34. He looked at her again. His expression was not dismissive. It was the expression of a professional who has encountered an unknown variable and is recalculating. He bid 36. She bid 40. He did not bid again immediately. There was a pause of perhaps 10 seconds during which the room was not quite quiet, but the quality of its sound changed. The way a room's sound changes when the people in it stop conducting their own thoughts and begin attending to something else. Then he set his paddle on the table. The auctioneer confirmed the bid, $40 per acre, 130 acres, total $5,200. Temperance Aldrich took the pen from her coat pocket, signed the transfer documentation at the clerk's table, and wrote a personal check from the Muskingum Valley Savings Bank for the full amount. Not a bank draft arranged in advance. A personal check from the account Thomas Carver managed, written with the pen she carried, in the same handwriting she used in the ledger. The room around her had the particular quality of a place where people are working very hard to appear as though nothing unusual has happened, while also not being able to look away from the thing that has happened. The 2 neighboring farmers were standing together near the door. One of them had his hat in his hands. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the floor, and his expression was the expression of a man engaged in a private arithmetic that is producing an answer he did not expect. Othniel Sparks was in the back row. She had not known he would be there. She saw him when she turned from the clerk's table, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not the expression from the April yard 8 years ago. That expression had been puzzlement, the natural puzzlement of someone watching a decision they do not have the context to understand. This expression was something else. This was a man who had just received the context, all of it, at once, in a room full of people, with nowhere to put it yet. She walked past him and down the stairs and out onto 5th Street, where the April air was mild and the bay gelding was waiting at the post. She drove back to Hales Crossing on the river road with the signed transfer documentation in her coat pocket. The mild April light was flat, and even across the fields, the kind of light that makes distances hard to judge, and she did not try to judge them. She watched the road and thought about the north quarter of the Metz property, which had always drained poorly and which Harold's drainage tile had only partially addressed. What the tile needed to make it useful was a connecting line to the field ditch along the county road that Harold had never gotten to because the money had run out before the project was complete. That connecting line was perhaps 40 feet of work. She had the tile. The ditch was already graded. This was the thought she allowed herself on the drive home. 40 feet of drainage tile. Not the $5,200, not the room at the courthouse, not Othniel's expression in the back row. The 40 feet of tile that would make the north quarter productive instead of marginal. The next thing was always the next thing, and the space between what had just happened and what came next was not a space she was comfortable leaving unfilled with specific work. The county found out over the following week in the same way the county found out most things. Through the courthouse record, which was public, and through the man who had been standing at the post outside when she came out and who had watched her untie the gelding and drive away and had subsequently told 3 people what he had seen. And those 3 people had each told several more. By Thursday of the following week, the Mets property purchase was the primary subject at Mabel's Ordinary, and at Vaught's, and at the Cooperative Warehouse, and the conversations had the quality of people trying to construct an explanation for something that did not fit the explanation they had already constructed. $5,200 in cash from a personal account by a woman who had paid $48 for bent tin 8 years ago and had never, in the interval, done anything visible enough to account for the difference. What the county did not know because she had not told anyone, and the information was not in the courthouse record, was the total of what the ledger contained. The sale amounts were between her and her buyers, all of them conducted in cash at the point of delivery, recorded in the green cloth account book that sat in the drawer of the kitchen table. The Muskingum Valley Savings Bank knew the deposits. Thomas Carver knew the balance. Nobody else had asked. The conversations were not unkind, precisely, but they had the discomfort of communities that have invested in a particular account of a person and are now being asked to revise it without having been given the materials for the revision. The $48 purchase had been a consensus verdict. The verdict had been wrong. The difficulty with consensus verdicts that turn out to be wrong is that the people who held the verdict most loudly are the ones who feel the correction most sharply, and the people who feel it most sharply are not always the people best equipped to feel it gracefully. Temperance heard secondhand through Louisa that the conversations were happening. She received this information with the same attention she brought to weather reports, useful for planning, not available for argument. She did not go to Mabel's Ordinary to provide context. She went to the north field of the new property with a spade and a length of chalk line to mark where the drainage tile connection needed to run. By June of 1891, the connecting line was in. The north quarter drained for the first time in Harold's memory and would drain going forward, and the ground that had been marginal in wet years became the most consistent ground on the parcel because the topsoil was deep in the drainage, now that it worked, kept the root zone from saturating. She put winter wheat in that quarter in October and pulled a yield the following June that the ledger recorded without editorial comment. The shop continued. Brevard's clearance lots came on their irregular schedule, 4 times in 1891, 3 in 1892, twice in 1893 when the mill's production contracted with the broader economic softening. The Dresden contractor continued his deliveries. Wendell Birch in Coshocton had no further water-damaged lots, but had begun sending her word when neighboring dealers had surplus custom material they were disposing of at cost, a form of referral that cost him nothing, and had built, over the years of their acquaintance, into something that functioned like a network, without either of them ever having named it that. Georgie Sparks arrived in the summer of 1892. She was Othniel and Louisa's daughter, 13 years old, with her mother's steadiness and something in her hands that was immediately visible to anyone who watched her work with them. Louisa had asked if Georgie could spend the summer at the Hales Crossing farm, framing it as a practical arrangement, which it was, because Louisa had 2 younger children underfoot and a summer, without Georgie managing some of the household work, would be simpler. Temperance agreed because she had seen Georgie in the shop the previous winter when the family had come for Christmas and had watched the girl examine the break with the specific attention of someone who is not performing curiosity but actually has it. The first week of June, Temperance put Georgie in the shop. She started her on the finished stack work, moving processed bundles from the sorting floor to the storage wall, learning by handling how the bundles were organized, what the tags meant, which profiles went in which section. It was not skilled work. It was foundational work, the kind that teaches you the vocabulary of a place before you are asked to use it in a sentence. Georgie did it without complaint, which was the correct response, and without performance, which was harder to manage at 13 than it looked. By the second week, Temperance had her feeding sheet stocked to the break while she operated the handle. Having a second person made the long panel work cleaner and faster. Georgie learned quickly what was wanted: feed smoothly, hold the panel flat against the fence, release on the signal, not before. By the end of June, Temperance let her run the rehem work on the 28-gauge panels, which were the most forgiving stock in the shop and the most repetitive work in the sequence. Georgie stood at the break and fed and clamped and corrected and released, and Temperance stood back and watched without saying anything, until there was something worth saying, which was how Silas had watched her. The hem gap was inconsistent for the first 3 days. On the 4th day, it tightened. On the 7th day, Temperance took down the gauge tool from the nail beside the slip roller, walked to the finished stack, and checked 6 panels at random. 4 of the 6 were within tolerance. 2 were at the edge of tolerance but within it. She hung the gauge tool back on its nail. "You have good hands," she said at once, quietly in the same register Silas had used, and went to the other side of the shop to work on the sorting. Georgie did not turn around. She pulled the next panel and fed it into the brake. The summer of 1892 established a pattern that held for the following years. Georgie came every summer, each year taking on more of the sequence, each year the work she could handle independently expanding, while the work she still needed guidance on contracted. By 1895, she was running full processing shifts on her own, while Temperance did farm work, checking in at the end of the shift to report what had been processed and flag anything she had questions about. By 1897, the questions were rare and the processing was, in every practical measure, hers. What Georgie also absorbed, because she was in the shop when the deliveries came, and when the buyers' letters arrived, and when Temperance sat at the kitchen table with the ledger on winter evenings, was the structure of the operation. Not as something explained to her, but as something she inhabited over years, until it was comprehensible from the inside. She understood where each source of feedstock came from, and why each relationship with that source had developed the way it had. She understood which community buyers ordered on a seasonal schedule, and which ordered when a specific project arose, and she had begun by 1896 to keep her own correspondence with 2 of the Ohio buyers, writing their orders into a scheduling ledger. She had started in a composition notebook she bought at Vought's. In the summer of 1895, a fabricator in Mahoning County, who built agricultural storage structures, had been generating tin cutoffs from every project, and had been paying to have them hauled to the landfill at a cost that had grown from an acceptable line item into a monthly irritation. His wife's cousin in Dresden knew Aldous Payne. Aldous Payne knew Temperance. The introduction was made in a letter, and the arrangement was established by the end of that summer. The Mahoning County fabricator shipped his cutoffs by rail to Zanesville at his own freight cost because it was still cheaper than the landfill fee, and Temperance collected them from the freight office and paid a per hundredweight price that made the arrangement worth maintaining for both parties. Rail-delivered material was a different feedstock than what she had been working with. The cutoffs were shorter and more irregular than mill rejects, requiring more assessment time and more judgment about what could be usefully formed. But the volume was consistent, which the mill lots were not, and consistency of supply had a value that the ledger did not capture directly, but which she understood from the difference between months when she had material to process and months when she was waiting. By 1896, Temperance Aldrich was 44 years old. She had been farming the same ground for her entire adult life and running the shop for 13 years, and she had not, in those years, been asked to speak at anything. This was not remarkable to her. The county's opinion of her and the county's invitations were separate things, and she had not been waiting for the invitation. The Muskingum County Farmers Association held its annual meeting in October at the courthouse building, where she had purchased the Metz property 5 years earlier. The program committee had sent the invitation in September. The invitation asked if she would address the assembled membership on the subject of her operation, specifically the aspects of it that had proven resilient during the agricultural contraction years. She read the invitation twice at the kitchen table and then set it beside the ledger and left it there for 2 days while she decided. The decision she was making was not whether she had anything to say. It was whether saying it, in that room to those people, would accomplish something more than satisfying a curiosity that had been 8 years in forming, and might as well have been left curious. She was not interested in performing her own vindication. She was interested in whether the information she had was information that could be used by the people she would be addressing, and whether the way she would have to present it would make it usable or would make it something else. She wrote back and said she would come. The courthouse room on the second Thursday of October held perhaps 60 men, which was more than she had expected. The expectation that the audience had come out of curiosity about her specifically was something she recognized and set aside before she stood up, because the curiosity of an audience is not the same as its receptivity, and the difference between them was everything. She spoke for 11 minutes. She had not written anything down because writing it down would have required deciding the order in advance. And the order she wanted was the order that the logic demanded, which she knew, and which did not require notes to remember. She said she had spent 13 years processing material the market considered worthless and selling it to buyers who considered it valuable. The difference between those two judgments was not the material. It was the labor applied to it, and the labor was only possible because she owned the tools that performed it. She owned the tools because she had never borrowed money to buy something she could buy with savings if she waited. She had savings because she had spent 13 years selling material the market considered worthless. She said she understood that sounded circular, and that it was circular, and that circular was exactly what it was supposed to be, because the circle was the point. She said her father had taught her this in a shop on Dillon Falls Road, and she had been slow to understand that what he was teaching was not sheet metal fabrication, though it was also sheet metal fabrication. What he was teaching was the arithmetic of owning your tools outright, and the arithmetic of waiting until you can pay for what you need instead of borrowing toward what you want, and the arithmetic of the difference between a business that can survive a bad year and a business that requires good years to remain a business. She said she thought that arithmetic was learnable. She said she thought it was not being taught as consistently as it should be, and that she considered that a problem worth naming. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the gap between the end of a speech and the beginning of applause. Then the applause came, and it was genuine, which she could distinguish from polite, and she received it with a nod and kept her hands in her lap. Othniel was in the third row. He had been a member of the association for more than 20 years. Beside him sat a wheat farmer from Blue Rock Township who had not expanded during the contraction years because he had been conservative by temperament rather than calculation and had arrived at the same position through a different route. The man leaned toward Othniel and said something Temperance could not hear from the podium side of the room. Othniel's response was not audible either, but his expression when he said it was the expression of a man who has just been asked a question, the answer to which costs him something to give honestly. He looked at the floor for a moment, then looked up, and his expression had resolved into something quieter. Outside the courthouse afterward, the October evening was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that comes when the last of the summer humidity has finally committed to leaving. Temperance was untying the gelding from the post on 5th Street when she heard Othniel's boots on the sidewalk behind her. He had his hat in his hand. She noticed this because he always had his hat in his hand at moments that mattered to him, and she had been noticing this long enough that it had become a reliable indicator. "I owe you an apology." His voice was direct, the way his voice was when he had decided something, for 1883, for the mill yard. She finished untying the gelding's lead and did not turn around immediately. "You don't? I think I do." She turned to face him. "What you didn't give me in 1883 is your approval. I didn't need it then and I managed without it, and I don't hold the absence of it against you now." She paused. "What I needed in 1883 was the Brevard lot and the break in the kitchen table to work the numbers out on. I had all of those things." He stood with the hat in his hands, working something through that she could not see. And then he nodded once. "Georgie's going to be better at this than either of us." That was not what she had expected him to say, and the unexpectedness of it produced in her something she did not perform or announce, a small interior shift of the kind that only becomes visible much later when you are trying to trace where something began. "Yes," she said. "She is." She got up onto the wagon and drove home. In the autumn of 1899, Thomas Carver at the Muskingum Valley Savings Bank sent her a personal letter, handwritten on the bank's cream-colored correspondence paper. He had been managing her account for 18 years. The letter said that in his professional experience, which by that point extended to 32 years at the bank, and included the management of accounts belonging to farmers, merchants, contractors, and several estate trusts, he had not seen the kind of consistent, uninterrupted accumulation her account represented, and he wanted her to know that. He said it was, in his view, worth remarking on. She read the letter at the kitchen table. She wrote back the following day, thanking him and adding that she attributed the consistency primarily to the absence of loans, which had the effect of making the floor of the account a fixed point rather than a moving one, and that she had learned this from her father, who had learned it from the particular education of spending 20 years watching what happened to people who built on moving floors. Thomas Carver kept the letter. She did not know this. He put it in the file alongside the account records, and when he retired from the bank in 1911, the file went into the bank's archive, and the letter stayed there. In the spring of 1901, Georgie added a fourth supply source without asking for guidance, because she had not needed to ask. A building supply dealer in Coshocton County, who was closing his warehouse operation, had come to her through Wendell Birch's referral network, offering a mixed lot of overstocked and slightly damaged roofing material. She assessed the lot herself, negotiated the price within the parameters she had observed, Temperance use for nearly 20 years, paid from the operation's working account, and processed the material into the spring delivery schedule without disruption. She told Temperance about it at dinner the following week, presenting it as information rather than as something requiring approval. "What did you pay?" Temperance served the bread without looking up. Georgie gave the number. Temperance considered it for a moment. "I'd have paid $5 less." He wouldn't have taken $5 less. Georgie was not defensive. She was reporting. I asked. The conversation moved on to the spring field rotation. In the fall of 1903, Louisa came to stay at the farm for 6 weeks, while Othniel recovered from a broken arm. It was the longest continuous period the two sisters had spent under the same roof since childhood, and it established between them a rhythm of conversation that had not been available to them in the years of separate households and monthly visits. One evening in October, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them, Louisa asked something she had apparently been deciding whether to say for some time. "Do you think you would have been happier if you'd gone to Oxford in '69? The question was genuine. Louisa was not asking it to provoke or to reopen something closed. She was asking because she had wondered for 30 years, and they were old enough now that the wondering seemed more important than the protocol of not asking. Temperance set down her cup. The lamp made the table between them specific and the rest of the room general, the way lamplight does in October when the darkness outside is complete. "I don't know what I would have been. I know what I am." She looked at the ledger on the table's far edge, not with sentiment but with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of a tool that has been used to the point where it fits the hand. "Silas would have failed if I'd left. The farm would have been sold within 3 years. The shop would have gone with it. You can't know that." "No." She picked up the cup again. "But it's what the arithmetic said in 1869, and I've never found a reason to think the arithmetic was wrong." Louisa was quiet for a moment. "Othniel said something about you once, a few years after 1883. He said you were the only person he'd ever met who treated the future like a set of numbers that hadn't been filled in yet, instead of a story that hadn't been told yet." She paused. "He meant it as a criticism at the time. I know. He doesn't mean it that way now. I know that too." They sat with the lamp between them until the fire in the stove had burned to coals, and then Louisa went to bed, and Temperance sat for a while longer with the empty cup and the ledger at the table's edge, and the quiet shop outside the Met's ground beyond it. All of it paid for, all of it productive, all of it proceeding. The association meeting in October of 1896 had produced something she had not anticipated, which was correspondence. Not much and not immediately, but over the following year, 3 letters arrived from farmers in adjacent counties who had heard about the address from men who had been in the courthouse room, and the letters asked, in varying degrees of directness, how she had structured the salvage operation in its early years, specifically the question of sourcing, because they had access to mill-reject material in their own counties and had not known there was a market for it. She answered each letter in the same format as her ledger, specific, complete, without advocacy or performance. She described what she had done, and in what order and at what cost and with what result. She did not offer to consult or to expand or to participate in their operations. She offered the information because the information was what they had asked for. And she had been taught by Silas that the person who hoards a working method out of competitive fear has misunderstood what the method actually costs to run. One of them wrote back in 1898 to say he had established a relationship with a mill in Perry County processing similar material to the Brevard lots, and that the first year's revenue had exceeded his initial estimate by 20%, which he attributed to the buyer's market being larger than expected. She wrote back to say that was consistent with her own experience in the first years, and that the buyer's market tended to be larger than people expected because it was invisible to anyone who wasn't actively supplying it. In the spring of 1905, Georgie Sparks was 26 years old and had been the primary operator of the shop for 8 years. She had by that point built a contact ledger separate from the financial ledger, with a page for each buyer and each supplier, documenting not just the transactional details, but the practical specifics that made each relationship work. When the Holmes County elder preferred to receive correspondence, which Dresden contractor's driver took the east route, and which the river route, and why it mattered for scheduling, what the Mahoning County fabricator's production cycle looked like by quarter. This information had existed before, distributed across Temperance's memory and the margin notes in the order book, but Georgie had made it explicit and retrievable, which made it transferable. The Met's ground had been fully integrated into the farm operation by 1893 and performed consistently, the North Quarters especially, which had become, by general acknowledgement among the Tuesday warehouse farmers who tracked such things, some of the most reliable upland ground in the county. Nobody talked about the $48 tin purchase anymore, not in the way they had talked about it in 1883 and 1884. The conversation had been replaced by a different kind of conversation, the kind that happens when a community has been wrong about something long enough that the wrongness has become part of the community's own history, a thing to reckon with rather than to retell. Some of the retelling still happened, but it happened with a different valence, as a story about collective misjudgment as often as a story about stubbornness, and the misjudgment had shifted from hers to the community's. This was not a vindication she had pursued. She was aware of it the way you are aware of weather. It affected the atmosphere of certain conversations, and she adjusted for it, and it did not change the shop work or the ledger or the order in which she fed panels into the break on the occasions she still ran it. On an afternoon in October of 1909, she brought the ledger from the kitchen table to the shop and sat in the chair beside the stove. She opened the ledger to the first page she had written in 1883, the April entry, the $48 and the initial cost column and the underlining, and she read forward from there. She read through the 1883 entries. The delivery to the Brumbaugh farm, the Brevard arrangement. The first winter, which had been harder than the arithmetic had suggested and easier than she had feared. She read the 1885 winter entries, the February note about the 4-ton lot, and the cold in Callum Denby's hand. She had not written anything in the ledger about the February evening when she had sat in this chair and asked the question she refused to ask out loud. The ledger recorded what happened, not what might have happened if she had answered the question differently. Outside the shop window, the October light was going horizontal and specific, catching the surface of things at an angle that made them look more definite than they did at noon. The bay gelding was in the near pasture, moving slowly along the fence line. The woodlot on the far edge of the Mets ground was fully turned, the oaks holding the last of their color, the maples already stripped. From the other side of the north wall, the sound of the brake. Feed, clamp, the mechanical compression of the handle, release. Then again. Georgie was running a rehem sequence on the new Holmes County lot, which had arrived that week and which she had assessed and sorted and begun processing without announcing any of it. Because announcing it would have been a performance of competence that actual competence does not require. She closed the ledger. The index cards above the break numbered 23 now. Silas's 12, in his compressed pencil hand. Georgie's 11, in a different but equally precise hand, covering the additional profiles and the rail-delivered cutoff specifications and the gauge tolerances the Mahoning County material had introduced. They were all on the same oak plank on the same nail, in the same order of acquisition that Silas had established and that Temperance had maintained, and that Georgie had continued without being instructed to, because the order was the order, and it worked. The cutting oil can was on the shelf above the shear blade, where it had been since 1854. Georgie checked it before every long run, topped it when it dropped below the mark. Silas had scratched into the exterior to indicate the working level, and set it back in exactly the same place. Temperance sat for a while longer with the closed ledger in her lap and listened to the break on the other side of the wall. Feed, clamp, release. The sound of the shop as it had always sounded, before she had run it alone and before Silas had run it, and on forward into whatever came next, which would be Georgie's to decide. Based on arithmetic, Georgie would do herself at whatever table she chose for doing it. What Silas had understood and what she had come to understand through him was this: a tool you own outright keeps paying you back until there is nobody left to run it, and then it waits. It does not lose its capacity while it waits. It simply holds what it knows and keeps what it is, patient as iron is patient, until someone comes with the right hands and the willingness to start from the beginning. From the other side of the north wall, steady and unhurried, Georgie's sequence continued.